At the end of a cloudy afternoon, a wealthy, reserved man walks quickly through the most isolated part of his ranch. He holds a set of keys and avoids looking back. Inside a dark greenhouse, a 5-year-old girl covered in dirt and dried blood. On her knee trembles as bugs crawl up her legs. She sings quietly, her voice shaky, trying to hold back panic. In the stable, an old forgotten horse starts neighing non-stop. The man turns the key in the lock and walks away quickly. But the horse, in a fierce burst, breaks through the fence and heads straight for the greenhouse without hesitation. There, in the silence, what happens next defies everything you think is possible. Love stories with animals? Then subscribe now and don't miss a thing. Thanks for watching. Now, back to the story. In the rolling hills of Kentucky's bluegrass region, where thoroughbreds commanded respect and land spoke of legacy, Everett Caldwell ruled his 300-acre estate with unforgiving precision. His Morgan horses, prize-winning and meticulously bred, were known throughout the state, but so was the man's reputation for coldness. At 62, his face had hardened into permanent lines of disapproval, eyes constantly evaluating, cataloging flaws. The iron gates of Caldwell Farm opened and closed at exact times. Workers arrived at 5:45 a.m., not 5:46. Feeding schedules were followed to the minute. Even the weather seemed to bend to his will, rain clouds scattering when he stepped outside to conduct his morning inspections. The late April sun beat down on Everett's back as he walked the eastern perimeter, clipboard in hand. 3 fence posts needed replacing. The south pasture required reseeding before summer, inefficiencies to be corrected, failures to be addressed. He made notes in tight, controlled handwriting, each letter exactly the same height. His boots, despite the mud from yesterday's rain, remained impeccably clean, as if the dirt itself feared his disapproval. "Should have been done last week," he muttered, noting the delay in painting the equipment shed. His voice, rarely used except to issue instructions or corrections, cracked slightly from disuse. The estate operated like a perfectly calibrated machine, and he was its unforgiving engineer. The inheritance of Caldwell Farm had come with expectations. His father, a man equally rigid but with occasional moments of thawed humanity, had drummed into him the family creed, "What's built by discipline crumbles under sentiment." Everett had excelled at the first part, eliminating the second entirely. 20 years of military service had only reinforced his natural inclination toward order. Returning to take over the farm after his father's passing, he had implemented systems and protocols that maximized efficiency and profit. The farm prospered while the man withered, human connection sacrificed for control. As he approached the oldest stable, the one housing retired horses and tack, something unusual caught his attention. A splash of color where there should be none. The sound of a child's laughter, foreign and jarring in this landscape of regulated sound. Everett quickened his pace, rounding the corner to witness something so out of place it momentarily robbed him of words. A small girl, no more than 5 or 6 years old, sat cross-legged in the dirt outside the stable door. Her clothes, a faded pink dress and denim jacket several sizes too large, were smudged with earth. Bare feet, dusty and small, poked out beneath her dress hem. Most disturbing of all, she was feeding carrots to Storm Shadow, his oldest Morgan, a 28-year-old retired champion who tolerated no one but Jacob, the stable master. Yet there stood the ancient horse, head lowered gently to the child's outstretched palm, accepting the offering with a delicacy Everett had never witnessed from the notoriously temperamental animal. The girl giggled as the horse's lips tickled her palm, her laughter rising pure and unrestrained in the sterile quiet of Caldwell Farm. "What is this?" Everett's voice cracked through the air like a whip. The girl startled, dropping her remaining carrot. Storm Shadow's head jerked up, eyes suddenly alert. The child scrambled to her feet, but made no move to run. Instead, she stared up at him with wide blue eyes, uncommonly steady for one so young. "I'm sorry, mister," she said, her voice small but clear. "I was just making friends. This is private property." Everett stepped closer, noting details that fueled his displeasure. Tangled blonde hair that hadn't seen a brush in days, a small bruise yellowing on one thin arm. Dirt under fingernails, disorder embodied in human form. "How did you get in here?" She pointed vaguely toward the eastern fence line. "Through the broken part. I didn't break it, though. It was already like that." The fence he'd just noted needed replacing, an intrusion born of his own overlooked maintenance issue. This somehow angered him further. "Where are your parents?" he demanded, scanning the property for signs of trespassing adults. A shadow passed over the child's face, a complexity of emotion no 5-year-old should possess. "My mum's gone away for a while. I'm staying with my Uncle Wade, but he's sleeping. He sleeps a lot during the day." Something in her tone raised alarms Everett chose to ignore. The information was irrelevant. The facts remained: trespassing, unauthorized feeding of valuable livestock, disruption of schedule. "Your name?" he demanded. "Lily," she answered, bending to retrieve the dropped carrot. As she did, Storm Shadow nudged her gently with his nose, causing her to smile again. The interaction fueled Everett's growing irritation. The horse had never shown such affection, not to him, not to anyone. 30 years of prestigious breeding and training programs, and his prize, Morgan, was acting like a common petting zoo animal. "That horse is worth more than your uncle's house," Everett said coldly. "These animals aren't pets. This isn't a playground." Lily looked from Everett to Storm Shadow, confusion evident. But he was sad. "I could tell. Horses get sad too, you know. They just can't say it with words." The statement, delivered with childish certainty, struck Everett like a physical blow. The presumption that this child could understand his horse better than he could. The implication that he'd missed something so obvious about an animal he owned. It was intolerable. "Come with me," he said, reaching for her arm. Storm Shadow snorted and stamped, an unprecedented display of protectiveness that Everett chose to interpret as agitation. "You've upset my horse. You've trespassed. You've broken rules." Lily didn't resist as he guided her firmly across the yard, away from the stables. Her small legs had to work double time to keep pace with his deliberate strides. They passed the main house, a stately colonial-style building with white columns and black shutters, immaculately maintained yet devoid of warmth. No flowers in the beds, no personal touches visible through the windows. Behind the house, past the kitchen gardens and equipment sheds, stood a structure Everett had all but forgotten. The old greenhouse, built by his grandmother when the property served as both working farm and family homestead. Once, it had housed orchids and exotic flowers, a passion project for the elegant woman whose portrait hung, neglected, in the main house's library. After her death, Everett's father had let it fall into disuse. Now it stood, glass panels clouded with grime, as a relic of a softer time in Caldwell history. Perfect. Everett produced a key from his pocket. He kept keys to every lock on the property and opened the rusted door. Inside, dead plants still sat in crumbling pots. Workbenches covered in dust lined the walls. Spiderwebs stretched between abandoned gardening tools. The air was stifling, thick with neglect. "This is where trespassers belong," he said, guiding Lily inside with a firm hand on her back. "With other things that don't belong here." For the first time, fear flashed across the child's face. "It's dark in here," she whispered, voice suddenly small, "and there are spiders." "Should have thought of that before breaking rules," Everett replied. "Maybe an hour thinking about respecting other people's property will teach you something. Your uncle clearly hasn't." "Please don't leave me," Lily said, her composure finally breaking as tears welled in her eyes. "I'm scared of the dark." Everett hesitated, an unfamiliar sensation stirring beneath his sternum. He crushed it immediately. Discipline required consistency. Actions had consequences. This was a teaching moment, nothing more. 1 hour, he repeated, stepping outside and closing the door. The lock clicked with finality. Through the grimy glass, Lily's small form was already fading into the shadows as she backed against the far wall. As Everett walked away, clipboard once again in hand, he heard a sound that should have been muffled by distance and glass, but somehow cut through with perfect clarity, a child's voice. Trembling but determined, singing a simple song to ward off fear. Behind him in the stables, Storm Shadow began to stomp and whinny with unprecedented agitation, as if something fundamental in his world had suddenly, irrevocably changed. Margaret. Hayes had worked with horses for 37 of her 59 years. She'd seen everything from birth to death in countless stables across 3 states before settling at Caldwell Farm 15 years ago. Her calloused hands, perpetually smelling of oats and liniment, could calm the most spirited stallion or coax, the sickest foal to stand. The animals responded to something in her, a patience perhaps, or a wordless understanding that transcended the usual boundaries between human and horse. Mr. Caldwell tolerated her, because results couldn't be argued with. Under her care, Caldwell horses remained healthy, recovered quickly from injury, and performed at their peak. She followed his rigid protocols to the letter in his presence, then whispered apologies to the animals when he left, adding extra carrots or gentle strokes that weren't in the official care manuals. The afternoon had settled into the peaceful rhythm Margaret treasured most. The horses fed and groomed, the stalls cleaned. The younger, stable hands dismissed for the day, just her and the animals. No human voices to intrude on the communion she felt with these creatures whose emotions ran deeper than most people bothered to notice. She was checking winter mists, recovering tendon, when Storm Shadow's distress signal first caught her attention. The old Morgan, usually content to doze in his stall during the heat of the day, was creating a commotion unlike anything she'd heard from him before. Persistent whinnying, followed by the heavy thud of hooves against stall doors, not the typical behavior of a senior horse conserving energy. "What's got into you, old man?" Margaret murmured, approaching his stall with careful steps. 28 years old, and still proud as the day he'd won the Kentucky Classic. His coat, once midnight black with a single splash of white on his chest, had faded to a distinguished gray, but his eyes remained bright with intelligence. Now, those eyes were wide with unmistakable agitation. Storm Shadow paced the confines of his stall, tossing his head toward the open stable door, then back to Margaret, then to the door again. When she didn't immediately respond, he kicked the stall door with enough force to rattle the hinges. "Easy. Oh, there," she soothed, opening the door to check him for signs of colic or injury. Nothing. His pulse was elevated, but not dangerously so. No swelling in his legs, no signs of physical distress. Yet something had him profoundly disturbed. When Margaret stepped back, Storm Shadow immediately moved toward the stable entrance, stopping to look back at her with what she could only describe as impatience. After 37 years with horses, Margaret knew better than to dismiss their intuition. "You want to show me something?" she asked quietly. The horse nickered softly in response, moving forward with purpose. Margaret followed, concern growing. She'd seen horses react to fire before it was detectable to humans, sense coming storms, even locate lost foals. Whatever had disturbed Storm Shadow deserved investigation. As they emerged into the late afternoon sunlight, Margaret noticed something small and colorful on the ground near the stable entrance. A child-sized mitten, bright yellow against the dirt, clearly out of place on the meticulously maintained grounds of Caldwell Farm. She bent to pick it up, studying the tiny garment with growing unease. When she looked up, Storm Shadow was already moving with determination toward the back of the property, stopping occasionally to ensure she followed. Margaret's mind raced through possibilities as she followed the horse. No children lived on the property. Mr. Caldwell barely tolerated his adult employees, let alone their families. The nearest neighbor with young children was the Morales family, 3 miles down the road, and they wouldn't allow their children to wander so far. A visitor, but Mr. Caldwell never entertained guests with children. As Storm Shadow led her past the kitchen gardens toward the forgotten greenhouse, Margaret caught sight of Mr. Caldwell himself, emerging from the equipment shed with his eternal clipboard. The moment he spotted her following the horse, his expression darkened. "Hayes," he called, his voice clipped. "That animal should be in his stall. What's he doing out without a lead?" Margaret hesitated, instinctively closing her fingers around the small mitten in her hand. In 15 years, she'd learned to navigate Everett Caldwell's rigid expectations, towing the line between necessary honesty and self-preservation. Something in Storm Shadow's urgency made her opt for the latter. "Just checking his mobility, sir," she replied. "He seemed stiff earlier. Thought a short walk might help." Caldwell's eyes narrowed slightly, but he merely made a note on his clipboard. "See that he's returned to his stall within 10 minutes. The farrier is coming at 6 tomorrow morning, not 6:05. "Yes, sir." Margaret nodded, waiting until Caldwell had disappeared around the corner of the main house before continuing to follow Storm Shadow. The horse had paused during the exchange, but now resumed his purposeful stride toward the greenhouse, a place Margaret hadn't entered in years. No one did. It stood as a monument to neglect, the only area of Caldwell Farm not subjected to the owner's obsessive maintenance. As they approached, Margaret began to hear it, the faint sound of a child singing, the melody thin and wavering but unmistakable. "Row, row, row your boat," repeated over and over, sometimes breaking on what sounded like a suppressed sob. Storm Shadow reached the greenhouse first, pressing his muzzle against the clouded glass, nickering softly. The singing stopped. "Hello?" A small voice called out. "Is someone there? Mr. Horse, is that you?" Margaret rushed forward, peering through the grimy window. Inside, barely visible in the dimness, stood a small girl with blonde hair, her face streaked with tears and dirt. When she caught sight of Margaret, she pressed her palms against the glass. "Please help me," the child said, her voice steadier than Margaret would have expected. "The man said I have to stay here for an hour because I broke rules, but there are spiders, and I think I saw a snake." Shock and anger flooded through Margaret's body. 15 years of carefully maintained respect for her employer evaporated in an instant. She tried the door, locked as expected. "Stand back from the door, honey," she instructed, fishing in her pocket for the ring of keys she carried. As the head stable manager, she had duplicates for most of the property's outbuildings. Whether the greenhouse key was included remained to be seen. The girl stepped back and Margaret could see her more clearly now, small for her age, wearing a dress too thin for the cooling evening, feet bare and dirty. The third key, Margaret tried, slid into the lock and turned with a protesting creak of disuse. When the door swung open, the child didn't immediately run out as Margaret expected. Instead, she looked past Margaret to Storm Shadow, who stood watching with intense focus. "You told her to come," the girl said to the horse, as if this were the most natural conversation in the world. "I knew you would." Before Margaret could process this unusual interaction, the girl stepped forward, her small hand reaching up to take Margaret's weathered one. "I'm Lily," she said simply, "and I'm sorry I came onto the farm without asking. I just wanted to see the horses." Margaret knelt to the child's level, professional assessment taking over. No obvious injuries beyond a few scratches and a fading bruise on one arm. Eyes clear and focused, if reddened from crying. Thin, but not critically so. Still, the situation was alarming on multiple levels. "I'm Margaret," she responded gently. "Where do you live, Lily? Where are your parents?" "Mom's gone away," Lily said. the simplicity of the statement belied by the complex shadow that crossed her young face. "I stay with Uncle Wade now, in the blue house down past the creek. But he was sleeping, and I was hungry, and I saw the horses from our yard." Margaret knew the property, a rundown rental about a mile from Caldwell Farm, visible across the creek that marked the eastern boundary. Wade Simmons had moved in 3 months ago, a sullen man who worked night shifts at the processing plant and, according to local gossip, had a complicated relationship with alcohol and the law. No one had mentioned he had a child in his care. "Does your uncle know where you are?" Margaret asked, already guessing the answer. Lily shook her head. "He gets mad if I wake him up. Real mad. So I just go exploring sometimes when he's sleeping." She looked down at her bare feet. "I forgot my shoes today." Storm Shadow chose that moment to approach, lowering his massive head to Lily's level. The child immediately brightened, reaching up to stroke his graying muzzle with a familiarity that suggested this wasn't their first meeting. "He likes me," Lily said with certainty. "He told me his legs hurt sometimes, but he still likes to run in his dreams." Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cooling evening air. Children often anthropomorphized animals, but there was something uncanny about Lily's specific observation. Storm Shadow did indeed suffer from arthritis in his hind legs, a condition that had ended his showing career years ago, but that wasn't visibly obvious to a casual observer. "Has Storm Shadow told you other things?" Margaret asked, carefully monitoring the girl's reaction. "That's his name? It's a good name." Lily nodded seriously. "He told me he misses running in the big circle with people watching. And he told me the man who put me in the dark place is sad inside, but doesn't know it." A mix of wonder and unease settled over Margaret. Perhaps this was simply the active imagination of a lonely child. But Margaret had spent enough time with horses to know that their judgment of character was rarely wrong. If Storm Shadow had connected with this child, her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. Lily tensed immediately, pressing against Margaret's side. Storm Shadow's ears flattened, his posture shifting subtly to place himself between the approaching sound and the child. Everett Caldwell rounded the corner of the garden shed, his expression changing from irritation to cold fury as he took in the scene before him. His employee, the unleashed horse, and the freed child standing together outside the greenhouse he had personally locked. "Explain yourself, Hayes," he demanded, voice dangerously controlled. Margaret rose to her full height, one hand remaining protectively on Lily's shoulder. In 15 years, she had never directly challenged Everett Caldwell. She had kept her head down, done her job with excellence, and built a life around her love for the horses in her care. Now, looking at the small child pressing against her, Leg and the horse standing guard beside them, she felt something fundamental shift in her understanding of necessity. "I believe I'm doing exactly what needs to be done, Mr. Caldwell," she replied, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. "And I believe we need to have a serious conversation about what happened here today." Behind her, as if sensing the tension, Storm Shadow stepped forward until he stood directly beside Lily, his large body a living barrier between the child and the man who had imprisoned her. The sun was setting behind the main house, casting long shadows across the 4 figures locked in this unexpected confrontation, a tableau of protection, vulnerability, and the first trembling moment of accountability. In the silence that followed, Lily reached up and placed her small hand on Storm Shadow's neck, and Margaret could have sworn she saw something shift in Everett Caldwell's eyes, a flicker of recognition, perhaps, or the first hairline fracture in a wall built over decades. The kitchen in the staff quarters was never meant to be a place of confrontation, a functional space with worn countertops and a table that had served generations of Caldwell farm workers. It was designed for efficiency, not comfort. Yet as Everett Caldwell stood rigidly by the doorway, watching Margaret Hayes wrap a blanket around the small girl's shoulders, he felt the foundations of his carefully controlled world begin to crack. She needs food, clean clothes, and a proper place to sleep, Margaret said, her voice calm but unyielding as she placed a mug of hot chocolate in front of Lily. The child cupped her hands around it, steam rising to warm her face as she darted cautious glances between the two adults. And we need to figure out her situation. This isn't right, Mr. Caldwell. Her situation, Everett repeated, the words stiff in his mouth, is not our concern. The girl is trespassing. Her guardian... Uncle Wade isn't really my uncle, Lily interrupted softly, surprising both adults. Mom just said I had to call him that before she went away. Something in the child's matter-of-fact delivery silenced Everett's prepared lecture about property rights and responsibilities. He studied her more carefully than he had before, the fading bruise on her arm, the thinness of her wrists, the way she sat, straight-backed and vigilant, as if perpetually prepared for sudden change. Outside the window, Storm Shadow remained standing, refusing to return to his stall despite the evening feed already being distributed. The old horse had planted himself in direct view of the kitchen window, his behavior so unprecedented that even Everett, who prided himself on emotional detachment from the animals he bred, couldn't ignore it. When exactly did your mother leave you with this? Uncle? Margaret asked gently, sitting beside Lily and offering her a plate with a sandwich cut into triangles. 37 days ago, Lily answered immediately, selecting a triangle with careful deliberation. I've been counting, she said she'd be, back when she could, but I need to be good and not cause trouble for Uncle Wade. She took a small bite, chewing with the conscious appreciation of someone accustomed to uncertainty about the next meal. I tried to be good, but sometimes he forgets about dinner. Everett shifted uncomfortably. This level of neglect moved the situation from a simple trespassing incident into something more complicated. Something that might involve authorities, investigations, disruptions to the ordered functioning of his property. We should call the sheriff, he said, reaching for the ancient landline phone mounted on the kitchen wall. Report the situation properly. And then what? Margaret challenged, rising to her feet. They take her to emergency foster care while they track down this uncle who may not even be legally responsible for her. You know as well as I do how strained the system is in this county. That's hardly my concern, Everett replied, though the words felt hollow even to him. There are protocols for these situations. Like locking a frightened child in a dilapidated building full of vermin. Margaret's voice remained low, mindful of Lily's presence, but her eyes blazed with uncharacteristic defiance. Is that the protocol you're referring to, Mr. Caldwell? The accusation landed like a physical blow. Everett's jaw tightened as he struggled to maintain his composure. In 15 years, Margaret Hayes had never spoken to him this way. No one had, not since his father's passing. His employees feared him too much, and he had no friends to speak of, a fact he had always considered a point of pride rather than concern. I was teaching her a lesson about trespassing, he said, the justification sounding weak even to his own ears. An hour's reflection on actions and consequences. She's 5 years old, Margaret responded flatly. What she's learned is that adults cannot be trusted to protect her. Is that really the lesson you wanted to teach? Before Everett could formulate a response, a sharp knock at the kitchen door made all three of them turn. Through the window, they could see Jacob, the youngest of the stable hands, shifting anxiously from foot to foot. Mr. Caldwell, sir, he called through the door. You better come quick. Storm Shadow's acting real strange, and now he won't let anyone near the east stable. Tried to bite Carson when he went to bring him in. Everett frowned, moving to open the door. What do you mean he won't let anyone near the stable? He's a horse, not a guard dog. Jacob, barely 20, with a perpetually sunburned face, looked uncomfortable. That's just it, sir. He's standing there like he's on guard duty, won't budge. And well, his stall is right next to where we found those kittens last week, the ones we were gonna call animal control about tomorrow. Kittens? Lily's voice piped up from the table, suddenly animated. There are baby cats in the stable? Margaret's eyes widened in understanding before Everett could process the information. The feral cat, she said. The one I've been leaving food for when you weren't looking. She directed this admission to Everett without apology. She must have had her litter in the hay storage area. I've been meaning to check, but with the Morgan, foal being sick, you've been feeding strays on my property without authorization? Everett latched onto this manageable transgression, this clear violation of his rules, rather than the more complex moral quandary still simmering between them. Yes, I have, Margaret replied simply. Because it's the right thing to do. Just like taking care of Lily tonight is the right thing to do. Lily had already slid from her chair, moving toward the door with surprising quickness. I want to see the kittens, she declared, the first real childlike enthusiasm they'd heard from her. I'm really good with cats. I had one before we had to move. Hold on there. Margaret caught her gently by the shoulder. It's getting dark, and if the mother cat is feral, we need to be careful not to frighten her. Storm Shadow will make sure. She doesn't hurt me, Lily said with absolute certainty. He told me he watches over everything in the stables, even the little animals. The adults exchanged glances, Everett's skepticism meeting Margaret's thoughtful consideration. Jacob simply looked confused. I'll bring a flashlight, Margaret decided, reaching for her jacket. And we'll just look, not touch, okay, Lily? The girl nodded solemnly, but her eyes shone with excitement. As they prepared to head back to the stables, Everett found himself at a crossroads. The rational choice would be to stay behind, call the sheriff, and let the proper authorities handle this disruption to his ordered existence. The child wasn't his responsibility. The legal complications that might arise from involving himself further weren't worth the trouble. Yet something, curiosity, perhaps, or a strange sense of unfinished business, propelled him to follow as Margaret led Lily back toward the stables, Jacob trailing uncertainly behind them. The spring evening had deepened into twilight, the air holding that peculiar Kentucky dampness that presaged a storm. As they approached the east stable, Everett could see Storm Shadow standing exactly as Jacob had described, planted firmly before the entrance, head high, ears forward in alert vigilance. The other stable hands had retreated to a respectful distance, clearly unnerved by the behavior of the typically dignified but standoffish horse. He's protecting the kittens, Lily announced, straining forward against Margaret's cautioning hand. He says the mother cat is scared because too many people were making noise. Everett opened his mouth to dismiss this childish fancy, but the words died in his throat as Storm Shadow's head turned at the sound of Lily's voice. The horse nickered softly, ears pricking forward in clear recognition. Then, to the astonishment of everyone present, the massive animal stepped aside from the doorway, creating just enough space for a small human to pass through. See? Lily looked up at Margaret with vindication. He's letting me visit them. Margaret looked to Everett, silently asking permission. He found himself nodding despite the absurdity of seeking authorization from a horse to enter his own stable. I'll go with her, Margaret said, accepting the flashlight Jacob offered. We'll be careful not to disturb the mother too much. As the pair disappeared into the dimness of the stable, Everett remained outside with Jacob and the other stable hands, an uncomfortable silence settling over them. The men kept darting glances his way, clearly uncertain how to behave in this unprecedented situation. Everett Caldwell, letting a trespassing child dictate activities on his property, allowing his strict schedule to be disrupted by kittens. The world had clearly tilted on its axis. Sir Carson, the oldest of the hands, finally spoke up. About that girl. She been out here before? Everett narrowed his eyes. What do you mean? Carson shifted uncomfortably. Just that Well, I've seen her a few times over the past month, watching from the creek bed. Never came onto the property before today, far as I know. Figured she was from one of the houses down the road. And you didn't think to mention this? Everett's tone was sharp. Carson shrugged. No harm in a kid watching horses from public land. Didn't think it was worth bothering you about. He hesitated, then added, she seemed like she needed something good to look at, if you know what I mean. Before Everett could respond, a delighted squeal emerged from the stable, followed by Margaret's gentle shushing. Moments later, Lily reappeared, her face transformed by wonder. 5 kittens, she announced, bouncing on her toes. They're so tiny their eyes aren't even open yet. And the mama cat let me pet her. Margaret says she's not really wild, just scared. She thinks someone abandoned her. As the child chattered excitedly, describing each kitten's coloring in meticulous detail, Everett found his attention drawn to Margaret, who had emerged behind Lily with a strangely pensive expression. Mr. Caldwell, she said quietly, drawing him aside while Lily continued regaling the stable hands with her discoveries. There's something you should see. Curious, despite himself, Everett followed Margaret back into the stable. She led him to the far corner of the hay storage area, where her flashlight illuminated a makeshift nest. A thin grey tabby cat lay curled, protectively around 5 tiny, squirming kittens, her eyes watching the humans with cautious tolerance. Not that, Margaret said, directing the flashlight beam slightly to the right of the feline family. That. There, half buried in the hay, was a small backpack, faded pink, with a unicorn patch sewn crookedly onto the front pocket. Margaret reached down and carefully extracted it, opening the main compartment to reveal its contents: a worn teddy bear missing one eye, a small photo album, a child's hairbrush, and a carefully folded change of clothes. She's been planning this, Margaret said softly, ensuring they were out of Lily's earshot. She's been watching the farm, figuring out routines, working up the courage to come here, and she brought her most precious belongings with her. Everett stared at the pathetic collection of a 5-year-old's treasures, something uncomfortable shifting in his chest. You're suggesting she was running away to my farm? I'm suggesting, Margaret replied carefully, that when a child packs her teddy bear and family photos and chooses your property as her destination, there's a reason. Something about this place represented safety to her. She paused, her voice dropping even lower. I checked the photo album. There's a woman who must be her mother in most of the pictures, and in one of them she's standing right here, in this stable, next to a much younger Storm Shadow. The photo is dated 15 years ago. Everett felt as if the stable floor had suddenly tilted beneath his feet. 15 years ago, when he had just taken over the farm after his father's death, when he was still transitioning from military life back to civilian existence, establishing the rigid protocols that would come to define Caldwell Farm under his stewardship. Let me see that, he demanded, taking the small album from Margaret's hands. The photos were faded, many of them creased from frequent handling. A blonde woman, smiling in most of them, holding an infant, then a toddler, then a slightly older Lily. And there, exactly as Margaret had described, the same woman standing. In his stable, one hand resting on Storm Shadow's gleaming neck, smile radiant. Memory stirred, fragmented, resisted, but insistent. A young woman applying for a position as an exercise rider, talented but untrained, his curt dismissal. His father, still alive then but failing, overruling him. Sarah has a natural way with the horses, Everett, something you could learn from. Sarah. The name surfaced from some locked cabinet in his mind. Sarah Kincaid, he murmured, the syllables foreign on his tongue after so many years. Margaret's sharp intake of breath confirmed his suspicion. You knew her? Briefly, Everett replied, discomfort mounting as more memories emerged. Sarah's gentle handling of the horses, her quiet defiance of his stricter methods. The day he'd fired her after his father's passing, her stricken expression as she collected her final paycheck. She worked here for less than a year before I fully took over operations. A clatter from the stable entrance broke the moment. Lily had returned, now flanked by Storm Shadow, who had somehow inserted himself between the child and the other stable hands in yet another display of unexpected protectiveness. "Can I sleep near the kittens tonight?" Lily asked, addressing her question to Margaret rather than Everett. "I'll be really quiet. I promise they won't even know I'm there." Margaret looked to Everett, the unspoken question heavy between them. What happens now? The sheriff's office was still a phone call away. The uncle presumably remained unaware of Lily's absence. The proper authorities could be summoned. Protocols followed. Outside, the first heavy drops of spring rain began to fall, pattering against the stable roof. In a steady rhythm, thunder rumbled in the distance, promising a substantial storm. Storm Shadow lowered his massive head to nudge Lily gently, and the child reached up to stroke his muzzle with the easy familiarity of an old friendship. Sarah Kincaid's daughter, here on his property, seeking refuge, and his prize horse. The one creature on Caldwell Farm he had never fully bent to his will, standing guard over her as if appointed to the task. The universe, it seemed, had a perverse sense of irony. "You'll sleep in the house," Everett heard himself say, the decision forming even as the words left his mouth. "The blue bedroom in the east wing, it has a view of the stables." He paused, then added, stiffly, "You can check on the kittens first thing in the morning." Lily's eyes widened, darting to Margaret for confirmation that she had heard correctly. Margaret looked equally surprised, but recovered quickly. "That sounds perfect," she agreed, taking Lily's hand. "I'll stay in the adjoining room, if that's all right, Mr. Caldwell, in case she needs anything in the night." Everett nodded curtly, already cataloguing the disruptions this would cause to his evening routine. The phone calls that would need to be made, the explanations to be constructed. Yet beneath the logistical calculations, a deeper disquiet stirred, a sense that by allowing this child across the threshold of his home, he was admitting something he had spent decades denying. As they prepared to dash through the rain to the main house, Lily paused, looking back at Storm Shadow with concern. Will he be okay in the storm? Thunder makes some horses scared. Storm Shadow has weathered many storms, Everett replied, surprising himself with the gentleness that crept into his voice. He'll be fine, and he'll watch over the kittens for you. The child nodded, satisfied, then took both Margaret's and, to his shock, Everett's hands as they stepped out into the rain, forming a makeshift chain of unexpected connections that carried them through the downpour toward the imposing facade of the house that had never, in all the years of his ownership, felt like a home. Behind them, Storm Shadow remained at the stable entrance, watching their progress with ancient, knowing eyes as the storm gathered force around Caldwell Farm. The blue bedroom had remained, unchanged for nearly 2 decades. Decorated in his mother's time for occasional guests who no longer visited, it possessed a formality that bordered on sterility: crisp linens, austere furniture, curtains that hadn't been drawn in years. As Everett stood in the doorway watching Margaret tuck Lily into the massive 4-poster bed, he was struck by how the child's presence immediately transformed the space, her small form creating a focal point that shifted the room's energy from abandoned to occupied. "The storm's getting worse," Margaret observed, glancing toward the window where rain lashed against the glass. Lightning briefly illuminated the grounds, followed by a crack of thunder that made Lily flinch. "I hope the sheriff can make it out here tomorrow morning." After much discussion in the kitchen, they had agreed to contact the authorities first thing in the morning. Lily had eventually fallen asleep at the table, emotionally and physically exhausted, allowing the adults to speak freely about her situation. The decision to keep her overnight, rather than drag her through further trauma, had been surprisingly easy to reach. "Sheriff Parker will come," Everett replied, his voice lowered to avoid waking the now sleeping child. He owes me several favors. Margaret's expression suggested she had thoughts about the nature of those favors, but chose not to voice them. Instead, she smoothed the blanket over Lily's shoulders and quietly retrieved the child's backpack from beside the bed. "We should look through this more carefully," she suggested, moving toward the adjoining sitting room. "There might be information that could help tomorrow. Contact details for her mother, perhaps, or other family members." Everett followed, closing the bedroom door partway behind him. The sitting room, with its stiff-backed chairs and outdated decor, seemed an unlikely place for the conversation that was about to take place, yet here they were. Margaret carefully emptied the contents of the backpack onto the small mahogany table. The one-eyed teddy bear, the photo album, the neatly folded change of clothes, a small toothbrush with frayed bristles, and tucked into an inside pocket, an envelope, yellowed with age and handling. "This was underneath everything else," Margaret said, holding up the envelope. "I didn't notice it before." The envelope bore no address, but was sealed. Everett hesitated, uncomfortable with the invasion of privacy, yet aware of the necessity. "We should open it," he finally said. "It might contain important information." Margaret nodded and carefully broke the seal, extracting several folded pages of lined paper covered in flowing handwriting. "It's a letter," she said, eyes scanning the first few lines. "Addressed to my darling Lily, when you're old enough to understand." It's signed by Sarah, her mother. She looked up at Everett, hesitation evident in her expression. "This feels very personal. Are you sure we should read it?" Everett was far from sure, but the mention of Sarah Kincaid's name had triggered that same discomfort he'd felt in the stable, a nagging sense that the past he'd so carefully sealed away was determined to breach containment. "Read it," he instructed, his tone more brusque than intended. "Summarize if necessary." Margaret began to read aloud, her voice soft enough not to carry to the adjacent bedroom. "My darling Lily, when you're old enough to understand, I hope you'll forgive me for the choices I've had to make and for the things I couldn't give you. Some journeys can't be shared, even with those we love most. By the time you read this, you'll have questions that deserve answers. You were born at Caldwell Farm, though you won't remember it. I worked there as an exercise rider before I knew I was carrying you. Your father never knew about you. That was my choice, my protection. He was a good man in many ways, but complicated, damaged by experiences I couldn't heal. When his own father passed, something in him hardened beyond reach. He let me go, along with anyone else who reminded him of more vulnerable times. I've kept track of him over the years. The farm has prospered under his rigid care, but I wonder if he has. If you ever find yourself needing shelter and I can't be reached, the farm is where the strongest part of my heart remains. There's an old horse there named Storm Shadow who knew you before you were born. I used to talk to him when I exercised. Tell him all about my hopes for you. Horses remember. They carry our secrets in their silent hearts. If life ever separates us, and if you find yourself in need of truth, seek out Everett Caldwell. He may not welcome you, but he deserves to know you exist, and you deserve to know where half your heart comes from, even the difficult parts. With eternal love, your mother, Sarah. Margaret's voice faded on the final words, the only sound in the room the persistent drumming of rain against the window panes and the distant rumble of thunder. She looked up from the letter, her expression a complex mixture of shock and understanding. "She's yours," Margaret said simply. "Lily is your daughter." Everett remained frozen, the words refusing to arrange themselves into a reality he could comprehend. "Impossible," he finally managed, though the denial sounded hollow even to his own ears. "Sarah never told me she was pregnant. It wasn't that kind of relationship." Even as he spoke, memory betrayed him, fragments of a moment long, buried, surfacing with sudden clarity. A rare evening of lowered guard after his father's funeral. Sarah finding him in the old greenhouse, surrounded by his grandmother's long-neglected orchids, a bottle of bourbon half empty beside him. Her quiet presence as he spoke of his father's final days. The greenhouse revived for a single night into a place of vulnerable confession. And then, there was one night, he admitted, the words feeling foreign in his mouth. After my father died, before I fully took over the farm, I never saw her again after I restructured operations. She never tried to contact me. Margaret studied him, her usual deference giving way to something more direct. Would you have listened if she had? The question struck with the precision of a well-placed blade. Everett had no answer that wouldn't condemn him, so he remained silent, turning instead to stare out at the storm-lashed grounds. Lightning illuminated the stables in brief flashes, and even from this distance, he could make out Storm Shadow's form, still standing sentinel at the entrance despite the weather. You should do a paternity test, Margaret said practically, gathering the letter and other items back into the backpack. Legally, that would be the first step, but... She paused, choosing her words carefully. Mr. Caldwell, she has your eyes, your exact eyes, and your mother's chin. I've seen the portrait in the library enough times to recognize it. Everett had deliberately avoided looking too closely at Lily's features, focusing instead on her behavior, her trespassing, her disruption of his ordered world. Now he found himself mentally reconstructing her face, the determined set of her, small jaw, the direct gaze that had held steady even when he'd intimidated her. Had there been recognition there, some genetic memory responding to shared blood? Even if what you're suggesting is true, he said stiffly, it doesn't change our immediate course of action. The sheriff needs to be informed. The proper authorities need to investigate the mother's disappearance and the situation with this uncle. Of course, Margaret agreed, but it might change how you approach the situation. If she is your daughter, she's a 5-year-old child who needs appropriate care, Everett interrupted, uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. My personal connection, if it exists, is irrelevant to ensuring her safety. Margaret stood, gathering the backpack. With all due respect, Mr. Caldwell, that's exactly the kind of thinking that left you alone in this museum of a house for the past 20 years. Her usual caution had evaporated in the face of the night's revelations. Some connections can't be scheduled or controlled. Before Everett could formulate a suitably cutting response, a small voice from the doorway interrupted. Them, are you my daddy? Both adults turned to find Lily standing in the partially open door, her hair tousled from sleep, the oversized t-shirt Margaret had found for her hanging down to her knees. Her expression was unnervingly composed for a child her age, as if she were prepared for any answer that might follow her question. Everett felt the room tilt, the carefully constructed walls of his isolated existence threatening to collapse. He had faced down hostile commanders, weathered financial crises, and rebuilt Caldwell Farm into a model of efficiency without flinching. Yet this small girl with her direct question had accomplished what nothing else had in decades, rendered him completely speechless. Margaret moved toward Lily, kneeling to her level. You heard us talking? Lily nodded. I woke up when the big thunder came. I was going to ask if I could check on Storm Shadow because he doesn't like storms either. She looked past Margaret to where Everett stood rigid by the window. Mom showed me pictures of the man who owns the horses. She said he was very important and very sad. She said I have his eyes. She paused, tilting her head slightly. Are you sad because you didn't know about me? The disarming simplicity of the question broke something loose in Everett's chest. He found himself moving forward, kneeling opposite Margaret, so that Lily stood between them. I didn't know, he confirmed, his voice rough with emotions he couldn't name. Your mother never told me. She said you were complicated, Lily. replied, carefully pronouncing the word. She said you had a wall around your heart because people hurt you. But she said that was okay because everybody has walls sometimes, even her. The child studied him with unsettling intensity. Your wall is really big. I could see it when you put me in the dark place. The mention of the greenhouse sent a fresh wave of shame through Everett. This child, possibly his child, had been treated with casual cruelty by the very person who should have protected her above all others. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had spent his life ensuring Caldwell Farm operated with perfect precision. Every animal and employee managed for optimal performance, while completely failing at the most basic human responsibility. "I'm sorry," he said, the words unfamiliar on his tongue. "For the greenhouse, that was wrong of me." Lily considered this apology with solemn deliberation. "Storm Shadow says people do mean things when they're scared. Were you scared of me?" The question, so innocent yet so penetrating, silenced the room's save for the continuing rhythm of the storm. In the distance, a brilliant flash of lightning illuminated the grounds, followed by a thunderclap so immediate it shook the window panes. The lights in the sitting room flickered once, twice, then went out, plunging them into darkness. "The generator should kick in," Everett said automatically, years of emergency protocols taking over as he reached for his phone to use as a flashlight. Before he could activate it, Lily's small hand found his in the darkness. "I'm still a little scared of the dark," she admitted, her voice smaller now. "But I'm working on being brave." Another flash of lightning briefly illuminated the room, capturing the tableau of the three figures. Margaret already reaching for the emergency lantern she knew was kept in every room. Lily, standing resolute, despite her admission of fear, and Everett, the man who controlled everything, kneeling with unexpected humility before a child who might be his own. "Being scared is normal," he found himself saying as Margaret located and lit the lantern. "Even adults get scared sometimes." "Are you scared now?" Lily asked, her face ghostly in the lantern light. Everett considered lying, then discarded the impulse. "Yes," he admitted, perhaps the most honest word he'd spoken in years. "I am." The generator hummed to life, restoration arriving in the form of dim emergency lighting. The storm continued unabated outside, rain pelting the windows with increasing force. Margaret rose, adjusting the lantern's flame. The hue grew. "I should check if any of the stable hands need help securing things. That lightning strike was too close for comfort." "I'll come with you," Everett said, surprising himself. "Lily, you should go back to bed. You'll be safe here." The girl shook her head decisively. "I want to check on Storm Shadow and the kittens. They need to know it's okay." Before Everett could argue, the ancient house phone on the sitting room table rang, its sudden intrusion startling all of them. He crossed the room in 3 strides, lifting the receiver with a growing sense of foreboding. "Caldwell," he answered, listening intently to the voice on the other end. His expression darkened. "I see. Yes, keep the roads clear for emergency vehicles. We'll handle things from this end." He hung up, turning to face Margaret and Lily with grim determination. "That was Sheriff Parker." The creek's flooding from the storm. "The bridge on Willow Road is underwater, and they're evacuating the homes on the east side of the creek, including the rental where Lily's uncle lives." He hesitated, then added, "According to the sheriff, Wade Simmons was highly intoxicated and belligerent when they arrived to evacuate him. He's in custody now for assaulting an officer, and he claims he has no idea where Lily is or when he last saw her." Margaret's face tightened with anger. He didn't even notice she was missing. "Apparently not," Everett confirmed, watching Lily. For her reaction, the child merely nodded, as if this information confirmed something she already knew. "He sleeps a lot during the day and gets really mad at night," she said matter-of-factly. "That's why I like to be outside when I can." Something protective and primal stirred in Everett's chest. an emotion so foreign yet so fundamental he almost didn't recognize it. Without thinking, he moved toward Lily and knelt again, bringing himself to her eye level. "You won't be going back there," he said, the words emerging as a promise rather than a statement. "Not ever. Do you understand?" Lily studied him with that unnerving directness. "Because you might be my daddy?" Everett hesitated, aware of Margaret watching them both carefully. "Partly," he admitted, "but mostly because no child should feel safer alone in a storm than in their own home." This answer seemed to satisfy her. She nodded solemnly, then asked, "Can we check on Storm Shadow now? He's probably worried." The simplicity of her concern. For the horse, her immediate pivot from her own uncertain circumstances to care for another being, struck Everett with unexpected force. This child, who had experienced such neglect, still maintained the capacity for empathy that he had methodically excised from his own character decades ago. "Yes," he decided, standing and offering his hand. "We'll check on Storm Shadow and the kittens together." As they prepared to brave the storm, bundling Lily in an old raincoat of Margaret's that swallowed her small frame, Everett found himself contemplating the letter still resting on the table. Sarah's words echoed in his mind. He was a good man in many ways, but complicated, damaged by experiences I couldn't heal. She had seen him more clearly than he had seen himself, and now her daughter, their daughter, stood before him, offering a chance he had never sought nor believed he deserved. The storm raged on as they made their way to the stables. Wind, driving rain horizontally across the property, yet despite the chaos of the elements, Everett felt an unfamiliar calm settling over him, not the cold control he had perfected over the years, but something warmer, more sustainable. With each step through the mud, each protective adjustment of Lily's oversized hood, something rigid within him continued to soften. By the time they reached the stables, Everett Caldwell, the man who had built his life around mastering every variable, was beginning to understand that some forms of surrender required far more courage than control ever had. Storm Shadow greeted them at the entrance, his ancient eyes somehow conveying both reproach and welcome. As Lily rushed forward to embrace the horse's strong neck, Everett watched with growing certainty that the most valuable lessons of his life were only now beginning, taught by an old horse and a small girl who had breached the defenses of Caldwell Farm on a spring afternoon when he least expected transformation. "She's staying," he said quietly to Margaret, who stood watching the reunion with knowing eyes. "Whatever it takes legally, whatever adjustments need to be made, she's staying." "The farm will never be the same," Margaret observed, not unkindly. Everett nodded, accepting this truth with surprising peace. "No," he agreed, watching as Lily led Storm Shadow toward the corner where the new kittens nestled with their mother. "It will be better." Outside, the storm began to ease, the spaces between lightning and thunder gradually lengthening as the worst of nature's fury moved eastward. Inside, the warm stability of the ancient stable, surrounded by animals who had witnessed generations of human drama without judgment, new foundations were being laid, messier than the rigid structures they replaced, but infinitely stronger. And as dawn broke over Caldwell Farm, the iron gates that had for so long served as barriers now stood as boundaries, defining not a fortress, but a sanctuary where broken things could heal, and where even the most carefully constructed walls could, with time and tenderness, finally come down. In the months that followed, changes rippled across the property like wind through summer grass. The greenhouse was restored to its former glory, orchids once again filling the space with color and life. The rigid schedules relaxed, making room for afternoon riding lessons and impromptu visits to the now thriving kittens. Sheriff Parker, after a thorough investigation that confirmed both Sarah's prolonged absence and Wade's unfitness as a guardian, helped navigate the legal process that eventually established Everett's paternity and granted him custody of his daughter. Storm Shadow, defying veterinary predictions, seemed rejuvenated by his new role as Lily's special companion. Though arthritis still troubled his joints on colder days, he carried her on gentle rides around the paddock, his steps careful and sure beneath her trusting weight. And Everett, the man who had once valued control above all else, found himself surrendering daily to the beautiful chaos of parenthood, to bedtime stories that ran long, to questions without ready answers, to the unpredictable wonder of watching a child discover her world. The transformation wasn't immediate or easy. Old habits of distance and rigidity resurfaced in moments of stress. But each time, Lily's unflinching gaze would find him, naming his fear with innocent precision, offering him the chance to choose connection over retreat. The community that had long kept Caldwell Farm at a respectful distance began to re-engage. The local school principal made house calls to discuss Lily's educational needs. Neighboring farmers stopped by with welcome gifts and invitations. The farm became, gradually but undeniably, part of the larger world beyond its gates. On the anniversary of the storm that had changed everything, Everett and Lily stood together in the restored greenhouse, tending to a particularly difficult orchid that refused to bloom on schedule. As Lily carefully measured water into its pot, her movements precise yet gentle, Everett recognized in her the best aspects of himself transformed. The attention to detail without the rigidity, the commitment without the coldness. "Do you think Mom will come back someday?" Lily asked, a question she posed periodically, always with the same quiet hope. The investigation into Sarah's disappearance had yielded few answers. She had left voluntary for a treatment program in another state, then vanished from official records. "I hope so," Everett answered honestly, having long since abandoned platitudes in favor of truth with his daughter. "And if she does, she'll find us here together." Lily considered this, then smiled, that brilliant, unguarded expression that still caught him off guard with its purity. "Storm Shadow says she will. He says she's just lost, not gone forever." Everett no longer questioned Lily's special connection with the old horse. Some mysteries defied rational explanation, and he had finally learned to make peace with not controlling. "Every aspect of understanding, then we'll keep the light on," he promised, gesturing toward the greenhouse lamps that now illuminated the space day and night, a beacon that could be seen from the main road even in the darkest hours. Later that evening, as he tucked Lily into bed in her room, no longer the austere blue guest room, but a space transformed by drawings, books, and remnants of childhood adventures, Everett realized that the life he had once defended so rigidly against intrusion had been saved by the very thing he feared: vulnerability. Storm Shadow, now allowed the privilege of sleeping in the small stable attached to the house, wickered softly in the darkness beyond the window. Sentinel, witness, and unlikely architect of redemption, the old horse continued his silent guardianship over the family that had formed in the aftermath of the storm. And in the quiet of his daughter's room, as Lily drifted towards sleep, with her hand still trustingly holding his, Everett Caldwell, once the loneliest man in Kentucky, finally understood what his father and Sarah had tried to teach him long ago: that the most valuable things in life could never be scheduled, managed, or controlled, only treasured in their wild and perfect imperfection. Outside, spring rain began again, gentle this time, washing the land with promises of growth rather than destruction. Inside, protected not by walls but by belonging, father and daughter breathed together in the harmony of newfound connection. Two souls no longer lost because they had found each other. Dear listeners, if the story of Lily and Storm Shadow touched your heart, there's so much more where that came from. Subscribe to our channel for more soul-stirring tales that remind us how love and compassion can transform even the coldest hearts. Hit that like button and share in the comments. Which moment brought tears to your eyes? Remember, every story we tell is a testament to the healing power of connection, even in our darkest hours.